Hello, I'm Father Timothy Matkin here at St. Francis Anglican Church in Dallas, and you're joining us for Sunday School, and we're looking at relics this time around, relics of our faith, the physical remnants of those historical events that happened back with Jesus and the apostles and the early church and the saints and martyrs and so on. So we began last Sunday with a study of the finding of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. And to sort of recap that, I wanted to begin with kind of a slideshow from, I pulled this from the New Liturgical Movement, Gregory DiPicchio, I forgot his name, I apologize. Anyway, he put together a nice little slideshow from a series of paintings. Now there's several different versions of these that kind of lay out the story of the cross. So, for example, if you go to one of those big relics of the Holy Cross, which is called the Basilica or the Church of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, but it's in Rome, you'll find in the apse where the altar is a panel that lays out the story. Here you have another church that does very much a same type of thing. So around the year 1385, the Florentine painter Agnolo Gaddi, from now on he's just Gaddi, he completed a cycle of paintings in the choir of the Franciscan Basilica of the Holy Cross in his native city of Florence. These frescoes, which are very well preserved, are the earliest surviving Italian example of a cycle dedicated to the legend of the true cross, based on the stories collected in the Golden Legend, as we talked about last time. So let's look at the first panel. At the top of the first panel, what do we see? Adam's son, Seth, receives from the archangel Michael a branch from the tree of life, which grows in the Garden of Paradise. In the lower part, he plants the branch in the mouth of his dead father, who lies in his grave, with Eve mourning to the right. From this branch grows the tree, which will become the wood of the cross. The depiction of a skull at the base of Christ's cross derives from this legend. Well, let's look at the second panel. What do we see here? The tree lives until the time of King Solomon, when it's cut down, and part of it is used to make a bridge. When the Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon, she sees in the spirit that the Savior of the world will one day be hung upon this wood. She therefore refuses to step on the bridge, but she kneels down in adoration. So she's kneeling before the bridge, not before the tree before it was cut down. She then tells Solomon that someone is going to be hung on that wood, by whose death the kingdom of the Jews will be destroyed. The king therefore has it buried deep in the earth as a protective measure. Curiously, one version of the story adds that the queen had webbed feet, which were made normal by touching the wood. What an odd detail. Any case, the third panel, what do we see here? The pool called Probatica, which is mentioned in John 5, verse 2, is built on the place where the wood is buried. Shortly before the time of Christ's Passion, the wood floats to the surface and is used to make a cross, the one which will eventually become the cross of Jesus Christ. In the background, in the upper left, are seen the sick people waiting for their chance to descend into the pool. And if you get to go into the pool when the angel disturbs the water, if you're the first one in, then you can be healed. The charming story in John's Gospel is how the man who's there waiting and who has some difficulty with mobility asks Jesus' help to help him get into the pool, which for those people first listening to the story must have made them chuckle to think, he doesn't even realize. There's his answer right there, not the pool, but the one who gave power to the pool, Christ himself. In any case, what about the next one, panel number 4? What do we see here? The narration switches direction, moving from right to left. The Empress Helena, mother of Constantine, discovers 3 crosses buried on the site of Mount Calvary. In order to determine which one of the crosses belonged to Jesus Christ, which one he died on, a dying woman is brought to the site and completely healed at the touch of the third cross, which ends up being, of course, the true cross, because it is the life-giving cross. In fact, speaking of life-giving, one of the other variations on the story is that rather than a very sick woman, it was 3 male corpses, 3 dead people, and each of them is placed on one of the crosses. And of course, the one who's placed on the true cross comes back to life. To me, that story doesn't really ring true, because my next expectation would be, well, are you going to take the other 2 dead guys and put him on the true cross to see what happens? But that's not part of the story. So I don't think that's exactly the way it went. To me, it sounds much more logical and probable that we have a sick woman who is healed. Panel number 5. What do we see here? Uppermost on the left side of the choir, St. Helena brings the relics of the cross into the newly constructed Basilica of the Anastasis, or Resurrection. So it's interesting, in the Eastern Church, it is referred to as the Church of the Resurrection. In the West, for whatever reason, probably because of our focus on the cross, it's referred to as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is, of course, the burial place. What do we find on panel number 6? During the 26-year-long war from 602 to 628, which was between the Byzantine and the Persian empires, the Emperor Khosroes, I'm not quite sure if I say that right, but I think that's it. The Emperor Khosroes takes the city of Jerusalem in the year 614. He is looting a whole lot, and of course, among the treasures that he takes are all of the relics of the true cross, along with other relics and sacred vessels from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So we have the destruction and the stealing of the precious artifacts in panel number 6. Panel number 7, as recounted in the Golden Legend, Khosroes builds himself a tower. Here it's represented in the fresco by a portico, with representations of heavenly bodies, and devices that will cause it to turn and make noise like thunder. Sitting in the midst of it, with the cross on one side to represent the Son, and a rooster on the other to represent the Holy Spirit, he orders the Persians to worship him as God the Father. In the middle, the archangel Michael appears in a dream to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, encouraging him to go to war with Persia. On the right, Heraclius beats Khosroes' son in single combat on a bridge. And then the 8th panel, the final panel. Here what do we see? We see that the Persians accept the Christian faith, but Khosroes refuses to do so, and is therefore beheaded by Heraclius, who then takes the relics of the cross and brings them back to Jerusalem. As he arrives at the gate of the city, the very same one through which the Lord had passed during his passion, it closes before him of its own accord. An angel appears and says to him, "When the King of the heavens entered through the gate to go to his passion, not with kingly adornment, but on a lowly donkey did he enter, and so leave an example of humility to them that worship him." And so, since he had been prevented and was given some insight from the angel, Heraclius therefore removes his royal robes, and as he approaches the gate, lo and behold, it opens of its own accord, and he enters into the city. One curiosity in this final panel is that the man standing behind the executioner is traditionally said to be a self-portrait of Gaddi. Well, with that reminder of the background of the story, we'll kind of go back and pick up where we left off. And what we want to do is look in the Fortunatus wrote several hymns, and he was inspired by the Holy Cross. So in our book, The Quest for the True Cross, and by the way, I'll put a link to these books that I've used. I need to go back and do that to the first one too. On page 7 it says, in 569, the arrival of a relic of the True Cross at the monastery of Poitiers inspired Venatus Fortius to compose his celebrated hymns in honor of the cross. Vexilla Regius Produnt, and the other one far more familiar to me, Pange Lingua Gloriosi. And we still use these hymns today. The composition of the great Anglo-Saxon poem, The Dream of the Rood, has also been linked to a visit of the Holy Cross. So King Alfred the Great in England received a fragment of the True Cross from Pope Marinus in the year 884. And we see, if you look carefully at the story of the Dream of the Rood and kind of follow the details, it's the dream, the poem is speaking in the person of the cross, and that's what the old word rood means. You'll find an oblique reference. So remember, talking in the person of the cross, it says, some buried us, these crosses, in a deep pit. Yet, thanes of the Lord, friends, learned of me there. And then there's an ellipsis. There's what looks like to be a missing part that describes the scene further. And probably describing how it was found, because when it picks back up, it says, then they decked me in gold and silver. So once they found me, this relic of the True Cross, they brought me out of the pit and they put me in a fancy reliquary composed of gold and silver. And then let's look for a moment at the lovely hymn Pange Lingua from Fortunatus. This is what he came up with when he was inspired by the visit of the Holy Cross to his monastery. Sing my tongue the glorious battle, sing the ending of the fray. Now above the cross the trophy, sound the loud triumphant lay. Tell how Christ, the world's Redeemer, as a victim won the day. God in pity saw man fallen, shamed and sunk in misery, when he fell on death by tasting fruit of the forbidden tree. Then another tree was chosen, which the world from death should free. Thus the scheme of our salvation was of old in order laid, that the manifold deceiver's art by art might be outweighed, and the lure the foe put forward into means of healing made. Therefore, when the appointed fullness of the holy time was come, he was sent, who maketh all things, forth from God's eternal home. Thus he came to earth, incarnate, offspring of a maiden's womb. And then the doxology, to the Trinity be glory, everlasting as is meet, equal to the Father, equal to the Son, and the Paraclete, triunal unity, whose praises all created things repeat. Amen. A delightful and wonderful, rich hymn. And that's the kind of thing that we find in the early church with the visit of the True Cross and other relics, is that they bring about and instill faith. They encourage faith in the heart of the believer. Now, where are the pieces of the True Cross today? Well, remember that the relics of the True Cross flowered faith. And so it makes sense that you would want to see the same kind of fruitfulness of faith all around the world as you saw right there with the relic of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem, and then, of course, brought also to Rome. So what we find is that, especially with the with the remainder of the cross that is in Jerusalem, that fragments are taken off, bit by bit by bit by bit, very small, and some are larger that go to some places, but many of them are very, very small, basically the smallest bit you can see. And this is the same thing that you find with other relics of saints, for example. You'll have a very small, looks like a grain of sand almost, bit of bone. Same type of thing, just a very small splinter of the wood of the cross. There'll be some bigger pieces that go to some more prominent places, but so many of them were very, very small, as sort of to maximize the spread of the relics of the true cross. So the fragments were broken up, the pieces were widely distributed. In 348, in one of his catecheses, St. Cyril of Jerusalem remarked that, quote, "the whole earth is full of the relics of the cross of Christ." And in another place he says, quote, "the holy wood of the cross bears witness, seen among us to this day, and from this place now almost filling the whole world, by means of those who in faith take portions from it." Now, what about the issue of, well, before we get there, let's turn to Joan Carroll Cruz's book, Relics, about where some of these pieces went. So, of course, a large piece was retained in a reliquary, a silver reliquary in Jerusalem. A piece was given to Constantine, who had it enclosed in a statue of himself, placed on a column in the Forum of Constantinople. The statue with the relic was thought to render the city impregnable. A considerable portion was brought to Rome by St. Helena, and for this she erected the basilica named the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. The relics of the cross retained in the reliquary chapel are 3 in number, each measuring approximately 6 inches in length, and are kept in a cross-shaped reliquary. And we'll also look at some of the other artifacts on another occasion that are kept in the church or the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem. St. Cyril, as we mentioned, says that pieces have been distributed all over the world. St. Paulinus of Nola, in the 300s, in one of his letters, refers to the fact that no matter how many pieces were removed from the cross, probably talking about all of those splinters that were taken and small pieces from the bit in Jerusalem, he says it didn't seem to grow any smaller in size. We find several times where some of these small pieces are made into jewelry or put in rosaries or things like that. St. Paulinus once sent to Sulpicius Severus a fragment of the cross with these words, quote, "Receive a great gift in a little case, and take this segment as an armament against the perils of this present and a pledge of perils of the present age, and a pledge of everlasting safety." Whether or not St. Paulinus began the practice or not, it seems that the distribution of small relics led to the making of reliquary crosses to be hung around the neck. St. John Chrysostom recorded that both men and women had relics of the cross encased in gold and wore them around the neck. So think about all the times you've seen jewelry where it's a chain, a necklace with a little cross pendant on it. As familiar as that has been, all of that really got started by distributing relics of the true cross. Specimens of those ancient crosses have come down to us to this day, many being kept in museums or in the treasuries of European churches. The cult of the cross and of its relics during the 5th and succeeding centuries was so great that even the iconoclastic emperors of the East, in their suppression of the cult of images, nevertheless respected that of the cross. Pope Symmachus built an oratory of the Holy Cross behind the baptistry at St. Peter's, wherein he placed a jeweled golden cross containing a relic. As we mentioned earlier, the recovery of the cross is commemorated liturgically on September 14th with the Feast of the Triumph or the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. And that was where the Emperor Heraclius was bringing the treasure back into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be encased in its newly rebuilt shrine. But he was unable to get in there, so an angel visits him and reminds him that the King of Kings once came through this gate very lowly, and so he discarded his royal robes and he was able to go right in. But also there was another king, King Louis of France, in 1241, divested himself of his royal robes when he was carrying a relic of the true cross in Paris. And he walked barefoot, carrying the relic in procession. The relic escaped destruction during the Revolution and is still preserved in France. Thank goodness. All right. Well, what about fraud? You know, as Cyril mentioned, there's pieces of the cross all over the world now. Well, by the end of the Middle Ages, so many churches claimed to possess relics of the true cross that John Calvin is famous to have said, quote, "There is no abbey so poor as to not have a specimen. In some places there are large fragments, as in the Holy Chapel in Paris, at Poitiers, and at Rome, where a good-sized crucifix is said to have been made of it. In brief, all the pieces that could be found, if they were collected together, they would make a big shipload. Yet the gospel testifies that a single man was able to carry it." Well, what do we think of that? Charles de Fleury in 1870 made a study, a very detailed study of the relics in reference to these criticisms that we find from Calvin. Also Erasmus made much the same type of charge. And so he drew up a catalog of all the known relics of the true cross, showing that in spite of what various authors have claimed, fragments of the true cross, if they were brought together again, would not reach 1/3 of a cross that would be, supposing a realistic cross to be about 9 to 13 feet in height, with a transverse branch of about 6.5 feet. The rest of the wood, so only 1/3 could have been made of that cross, of all the little pieces brought together. And in fact, the rest of the Holy Cross, the true cross, is simply unaccounted for and is lost to history. The largest surviving portion is preserved in the monastery of Caut-le-Massue on Mount Athos. If I say that right. I'm not very good at these foreign names. There are also, as we mentioned, large pieces in Rome, in Brussels, in Venice, Ghent, and in Paris. In Africa, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church also claims to have the right wing of the true cross buried in the monastery of Gishen Miriam. In Asia, the only place where a significant part of the true cross is located is in the Monastery de Tarlac in San Jose in the Philippines. There's another claimant to the largest piece of the true cross in the world, Santo Toribio de Libana, if I'm saying that right, in Spain, is another claimant to the largest piece of the true cross in the world. So this is in northern Spain, I believe, up in the Gallican territory. This relic is said to be the left arm, or from the left arm, of the Holy Cross. It was sawed and assembled in the form or the shape of a cross for the reliquary, leaving intact the hole where it was said that the hand of Christ was nailed down. The vertical bar is 25 inches long, and the cross bar is 15.5 inches long, and the cross has a thickness of about 1.5 inches. In 1958, a scientific investigation was carried out by Madrid's Forestry Research Institute and concluded that the relic is of a Mediterranean cypress wood, which is, of course, very common in Israel, in the Holy Land, and very old. It could be 2,000 years old. The wood was embedded in a Gothic silver gilt cross manufactured by the workshop of Valladolid in 1679. It lies in a housing of golden wood in a Baroque, domed, early 18th century chapel in the north wall of the church, looked over by an effigy of the chapel's founder, Francisco de Cosio y Otero, the Grand Inquisitor of Madrid and later Archbishop of Bogota in Colombia, who was born in the area. According to tradition, this relic is a part of that, of course, true cross that Empress St. Helena unearthed in Jerusalem. So how did it get from there to there? Well, from there, St. Turribius of Astorga, who was a custodian of the holy places, took it to the cathedral of his hometown in Astorga, Spain, where he was soon to be made bishop. When the Moors invaded Spain in 711, the relic was hidden, along with others, in a fold on Mount Viorna in the Libana Valley, next to St. Turribius's relics. Both relics, collection of relics, both the saint and the cross, were eventually transferred to the monastery of St. Toribio, which immediately became, of course, as you can imagine, a very important place to be visited by pilgrims on their way to Santiago de Compostela. In 1961, the monastery was put under the care of Franciscan friars as custodians of holy places. And for the Western churches in the Holy Land, they are also under the care of the Franciscan friars. For whatever reason, they were determined to be the most suitable custodians for these precious relics. Perhaps going back to St. Francis himself with the idea that they should own nothing, but all that they have are things that belong to the church. Makes sense. In 1817, Ignacio Ramon de Roda, Bishop of Leon, went to the monastery and asked permission of the prior of the Benedictine monks at that time to remove a portion of the cross. Now, I could imagine they responded, "Are you kidding?" I guess he was very persuasive. 2 pieces of wood, arranged, of course, in the shape of a cross in a reliquary, were given to Don Joachim and Don Felix Columbus, descendants of Christopher Columbus, for the chapel of their family castle in Asturias. In 1909, now this is where the story gets really strange. In 19, so you can, by the way, you can still go to see the largest known, at least in the West, reliquary of the Holy Cross, which is in that monastery of Saint Tiberius. But a little bit of that in a reliquary was taken by Christopher Columbus's descendants for their family chapel. Where is that now? Take a wild guess. And if you guessed rural Pennsylvania, you'd be right. So in 1909, Terry and Matilda Bowl inherited and imported to their American estate the chapel of the Columbus family, including an admiral's desk that belonged to the famous explorer himself. They brought from Spain to Bowlesburg, Pennsylvania, the entrance door and the whole interior of the Columbus Chapel with the relic of the true cross, which is there to this day. So if you want to see a fairly large, in terms of relics, I mean, big enough so you don't have to get out your glasses to see it, that is where you go, Bowlesburg, Pennsylvania. And what an odd place. You would think it would be left into some fancy church somewhere, but apparently not. So those are some places where you can find relics of the true cross. And then as we wrap up the show here, we'll have kind of a slideshow of different relics of the true cross in different places. And I hope you enjoy it. And we'll continue to talk about relics next time. So tune in again, or if you're local, come join us in person and we'll all learn together. You can, of course, look us up and learn all about us at our website, stfrancisdallas.org. Please like and share, and we will see you there. God bless.